Hello again. To conclude Chapter 5 and the first section of GE 201, I will go over the economic and geopolitical topics of the Caribbean region. Most countries have systematically tried to diversify their economies and rely less on cash crops. And some of the regions have had some success with this, but most of them are still engaged in this practice. Sugar drives a lot of the economy. Europeans became addicted to it. And it also gets distilled into rum, which is quite a popular drink. With the collapse of the Soviet Union and the guaranteed market, the income of the Cuban economy drastically dropped. Brazil and the rest of the Caribbean are the world's major sugar export. Haiti tries to export some coffee, but they're still only making $2 a day. It's not enough. Coffee can be grown with subsistence crops, unlike sugar, and this enables small farms to meet food needs as well as growing a cash crop. But that is also a big commodity that tends to bubble, and the coffee market, as I mentioned in an earlier video, has collapsed a couple of times. There were banana wars because Latin America tends to dominate this particular market, not the Caribbean. And they attempt to trade with the European Union, and the World Trade Organization forced the EU to drop the practice of giving their former colonies preferential treatment. And globalization has hurt Eastern Caribbean banana growers, because it seems like people seem to want the larger, unblemished yellow varieties. But that comes from Central America and not so much the Caribbean. The Caribbean tends to grow the bananas that grow here in the Marianas, the smaller variety. So they're trying new crops like okra or marijuana, tomatoes, avocados in an attempt to diversify. In the 1950s, Puerto Rico pioneered the concept of allowing foreign investors to set up assembly plants. They were one of the first to engage in this practice, later emulated by the Mexicans in the 1990s. Cheap labor, local tax breaks, and most important, federal tax breaks enabled Puerto Rico to attract industry. And in the 70s, it was working well for Puerto Rico. And this place is a commonwealth exactly like the CNMI is. But industry has declined there in recent years. And Puerto Rico right now, as of 2018, has serious problems because of the hurricane that went through there in the summer of 2017. The Dominican has set up free trade zones. The Chinese also engaged in this practice. Duty-free, tax-exempt industrial parks. And this globalization hurts manufacturing in the United States and Canada because they close the old plants and they go build new ones in the free trade zones. There's less regulation, less rules to follow. And the Dominican is the largest economic manufacturer in the Caribbean. Critics of international development believe that foreign investors gain more than the host countries. Well, that's why they go there to do it. Wages are higher than local averages, but they're still poor compared to the developed world of Europe, Japan, the United States. Another big industry of the Caribbean is offshore banking, and the Bahamas began this industry in the 1920s. And people go there because they don't have to pay any taxes. Imagine that. And this is where a lot of the drug cartels hid their money. They offer a lot of specialized services, and in 1976, this was the third largest banking center in the world. But money laundering is being prosecuted today, and they are still large, but nowhere near as big as they were in the 70s because of a lot more scrutiny into the practices that they are engaged in. In the 1990s, the Cayman Islands emerged as the region's new leader in banking, ranking only behind New York, London, Hong Kong, and Tokyo as of 10 years ago. And I'm sure that that's continuing. And these are some of the other countries of the Caribbean hoping to emulate the Caymans. The growth of this industry is indicative of the growth of the forces of globalization. Multinationals minimize their taxes by moving their assets to these tax-free havens. And because of the war on terror, many of these banks are being scrutinized more closely. Online gambling is another industry of the region. And some of the United States attempted to stop this. And it's not certain what's going to happen with this trade or industry. Tourism is huge. It's a similar climate to the Marianas, and it is beautiful. Wealthy North Americans have wintered in the Caribbean since the 1800s, and Cuba, before the Castros in the Revolution of 1959, was the Las Vegas of the Caribbean. And Cuba is open again as of 2016. You can go there on vacation now again, after it being closed for decades. The Bahamas is a very huge tourist destination, as is Jamaica. The Dominican attracts a lot of Canadians. $3 billion they got in the tourist trade in 2004. That's before the downturn, though. I'm sure it's not quite that high anymore. Canadians also like going to Cuba, and they've been going there. And this has changed. This is no longer true. We now have formal relations. This has changed. Since 2016, political relations have been established again. I repeat, political relations have been established again between Cuba and the United States as of 2016. Hurricanes sometimes destroy these tourist destinations, and they might not get rebuilt, but they're just going to go somewhere else and start over. And a lot of the money, these are multinational corporations that set up in these regions, and not all the money stays in the region. We've talked about remittances. Brain drain is sometimes a phenomenon of the Caribbean. They go somewhere to get educated and they don't come back. I've mentioned the Monroe Doctrine. This is a sphere of influence to the United States. And we have stepped into their affairs many times. We don't want to see European involvement, and that's why the doctrine was originally enunciated. And then in the 20th century, occupations have happened because of financial crises and other problems of dictatorship. And many times we also stepped in to protect the business interests there. And we've talked about the Commonwealth. Protested ended the naval bombing on Vecchio's Island. They periodically vote to go independent, just as Quebec did. Cuban Missile Crisis was a huge event. The Russians were building bases there. President Kennedy ordered a naval blockade. What was going to happen? That was the closest the world came to nuclear war in 1962. Eventually, a deal was made. They agreed to dismantle those bases in return for the United States dismantling bases in Greece, missile sites in Greece and Turkey. And the Castros are gone now. They are out of the picture. There is a common market that's been established. And these are the countries of the Caribbean that make it up. Again, it's the same idea. Removing trade obstacles, trying to reduce tariffs. Free trade is one of the ideas of neoliberalism. Deregulation, free trade, export-oriented production. These are the forces of the global economy. And that's it for this particular topic. And I will have some more for you in the coming chapters.